Good afternoon. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Laura Polari-Welbus, Executive Director of Encore Learning, and we've got a fantastic program. You're going to hear all about it. And first off, I'm going to introduce one of our partners from Arlington Public Library. Catherine Chiraboga is here. She's a partnership librarian, and she's here to also welcome you today. Unmute, Catherine.
Yes, thank you, Laura, for the warm welcome. And we're so excited to partner with Encore Learning of this event and previous events. We can't wait to do another one in person when that can happen. And now I will pass it on to Louise Kenny, the Special Events Teams Coordinator. Thank you again.
And I'm the third person to welcome you to this event today, and we're very glad that you're here. The topic that we have today is certainly timely. It's certainly relevant to all of us here. We're all interested in it, and we have an expert in it. So our speaker today is Dr. Richard Rubenstein. You may know him, having seen him at George Mason University. He's a university professor emeritus of conflict resolution and Public Affairs at George Mason. He's the author of 10 books on resolving violent social conflicts. He's a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he attended as a Rhodes Scholar, and Harvard Law School, and as a former director of the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter Center for Peace and Resolution and Conflict Resolution at George Mason. He lives in Washington with his wife, Susan, and writes regularly for online journals such as Counterpunch and is active in movements for peace and social justice. I will let him come on in a minute. I did want to remind all of you that to put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat function. And also at the end to stay on for a survey at the end, but I'll remind you of that later on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Rubenstein, who has kindly told me that I can call him Rich throughout the presentation, but more formally, he's Dr. Rubenstein. Rich?
Well, thank you, Louise. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. And thanks to Laura also for uh, helping us put this program together. And I'm going to thank all of you for being here and giving me a chance to teach again. I've been a professor emeritus for the past year and a half, and I have to say I miss being in the classroom. I speak around town here and there, but there's nothing like doing this sort of thing, especially with an audience as interesting as you all are. I posed the question: is America headed for civil war? Um, I'm going to try to. I'm going to talk about it for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion among ourselves. So, is America headed for civil war? So, I've kind of answered that question with another question, which is, can we resolve deep-rooted social conflicts? And if so, how do those conflicts get resolved? I don't have to tell you that we are a polarized society. This red-blue polarization that we've been involved in, roughly a kind of left wing versus right wing, um, ideologically speaking, a complicated matter which I can't even describe in great detail. It'll take all day. But you understand as well as I do that this is something that is producing a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of distress among all of our people. I mean, we have people in the same family who won't talk to each other um, about politics, at least, because of these disagreements. Even in my own family, we have such a situation. Um, People in the dating services, people who are doing running these online dating services are reporting that when people apply to the services, they say, don't put me together with somebody who's pro-Trump, or don't put me together with somebody who's anti-Trump. Um, This is interfering with our personal relations now, and of course, it has raised the question, since there has already been some violence associated. I'm going to talk about that more, but it's raised fears of civil war. And we have this 2024 movie. I don't know if you've seen it. I think it's probably worth seeing, although it's not going to tell you very much about our problem. It's it's not a basis, really. It doesn't give you a basis on which to discuss what this polarization is all about, or what can be done to to change the situation that we're in. But it is good to recognize, it seems to me, that this is not the first time that this has happened in America. That in fact, there's a lot more polarization than most people realize. In fact, I've been wondering myself why somebody hasn't written this book yet. I'm too old to do it. Yeah, one of you may do it. Um, because if you look at our history, you see about every 30 or 40 years, we have periods of intense, quite intense polarization. Mostly they are not terribly violent. In the list that I'm showing you now on the screen, we have the Revolution, the American Revolution, which of course was terribly violent, and the Civil War, which and Reconstruction, which were horrifically violent. In fact, the estimate of deaths in that war is still going up. It's now 700,000. Um, so we're in fact our nation in some ways is still traumatized by that war, and we have reasons, to fear that when we get polarization, it's going to get moved in the direction of mass violence. But mostly, it's good to realize, mostly that does not happen. In the Jacksonian era, populist progressive era, which there was very intense polarization. Again, families being divided over these issues. Again, political parties calling each other evil, not just wrong, but evil. Um, uh, some of the same kind of intensity that we see in our own era, we see in prior eras, including a certain amount of violence. If you take any of these eras, well, take the one that I'm most familiar with because I lived through it, and some of you did too, perhaps the movement era, the last period of intense polarization, I started in 1955 because that's when Rosa Parks got on the bus. That started really the civil rights movement. But especially in the 60s and early 70s, it became very intense, very divided, very divisive, and very violent. In fact, compared with what we're going through now, the movement was much more violent. If you just think of the year 1968, a time when I found myself in the streets of Chicago at the Democratic Convention in 1968. So I remember it really well, but that was also a year of assassinations, a year of horrific racial uprisings and riots. Um, we have not been living through that kind of violence yet, and I hope that we won't. But we now have to talk about what causes violence and what can be done to avoid it. Um, First thing I want to say is that characterizing the polarization that we're in now is not such an easy thing to do, especially when each side is calling the other the essence of evil. But so let me get a little bit more neutral about it and say that one of the sides to the polarization, the MAGA movement, first thing I think to focus on is that it is a movement. It's a social movement. A coalition, really, of many groups which have come together around a certain program that we'll talk about in a second, led by Donald Trump, who's clearly the leader of that movement. But this is not just a question of Donald Trump versus the world or Donald Trump versus other political leaders. It's not even a question of Republicans versus Democrats. The MAGA is a genuine movement. It's cross-class. It includes very rich people and very not rich people. It's based on various social organizations, such as religions. Evangelical religion plays a very important role in the MAGA movement. And I'm emphasizing that it is a movement because a couple of things. One is I'm as you'll see now as we continue the discussion, uh, I'm trying to shift the focus of discussion about polarization from people and personalities and personal intentions to the way the system itself, our system itself, produces polarization. And in this case, we have a social movement more than not just a particular leader, which is being combated by groups mainly around the Democratic Party, although not exclusively, but groups which don't really yet constitute a movement. They're I would say, in the process of constituting themselves a movement, but they are now trying to decide basically what their program is and who their leaders are, and in particular, how they plan to solve the problems which generated the polarization to begin with. So there's some asymmetry between MAGA, which is a well-developed movement with a well-developed ideology and which is in power with control of both houses of Congress, and the opposition to it, which is has to be, even when you see the headline "No Kings," no kings, that's not a program. It's a bit of a program. It's an attitude. So we talk about that as we go along too. How does that movement actually become a movement is a question. MAGA is a rebellious movement. It's a movement of rebellion. What are they rebelling against? Uh, the old regime. And in this case, although we may not be used to thinking of characters as radical in his own time as Franklin Roosevelt as an old regime, the system that MAGA is in rebellion against is what they have called the administrative state. Some people would call it the welfare state, or others would call it the warfare state. But it is a state in which a form of government which was radically changed by Franklin Roosevelt, whose enemies, by the way, thought he was a dictator, creating a system of government which played a much more active role in economic matters in the country than his predecessors, which tried to create a social safety net and tried to make economic changes that would be for the benefit of the working people in the country and the more marginalized groups in the country, and also immigrant groups, recent immigrant groups, which really altered the shape of American government permanently, made by making structural changes. And it was a system which was developed and expanded to some extent by Truman and Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society, and then which entered a period in which some people call a neoliberal democracy, in which leaders like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and others made certain additions to the New Deal, to New Deal and Fair Deal and so forth programs, for example, Obamacare, but which represented a kind of conservative trend in the Democratic movement, in which, in fact, some analysts have said that they've said that the party was hollowed out in the sense that it ceased being the militant instrument of the working class, became much more of a cross-class coalition willing to limit social change to the changes which were acceptable to very powerful economic interests and political interests in the country and in the world. Um, and as a result, problems which had begun to be obvious, begun to appear, even in the 1970s, became more difficult to resolve. And here, let me make a little case, which I'll come back to in a couple of minutes, that if we're really looking for the causes of polarization, and you're not satisfied with saying it's because Donald Trump is this kind of a person or that kind of a person, or the opposite, there are because what Trump calls lunatic leftists, are loose in society. If you're not looking for faults of character or faults of ideology as an explanation for polarization, then it seems to me you come around to realizing that there are systemic problems that generate polarization. That when you have, for example, growing income and wealth inequality, such that the United States is the most unequal country in the industrialized world in terms of the Gini coefficient and other measures of inequality, that it's a country which has had deindustrialization, no real wage increase for American workers since the 70s, endemic poverty in cities and in rural areas, which government after government has promised that that would end, and it doesn't end. A split between old industrial workers and newer industrial workers, a split, in fact, which has enabled the MAGA movement to to take the side of the people in the older industries, the workers in older industries against workers in newer industries, the workers with college degrees, and characterize the college degree workers as an elite. Um, these are all socioeconomic issues. And then I'm not going to read all of these notes to you. You can read them as well yourself as listen to me. But you can see that there are sociocultural problems that are worsening. For example, a plague of addiction and substance abuse. That there are related psychospiritual problems, unsatisfied needs of various kinds, which are called, people are talking now about, for example, loneliness as being a major problem for our country. People are talking about um, mental illness as being a major problem for our country. And these are problems which, shall I say, have been piling up and remaining unsatisfied no matter who's in power. It's not the Democrats' fault that these problems exist. It's not the Republicans' fault that these problems exist. It's the way the system operates that is responsible for the way the problems exist. And in addition to all of those problems, now we have these horrific external environmental issues, which many of which are, again, relatively new or now being recognized, climate-related natural disasters, for example, diseases like COVID, globalized diseases, and so forth. And the result of this uh, is unhappiness. The unhappiness, the discontent crystallized behind Donald Trump and the MAGA coalition in 2016. And you see here Trump shaking hands with the worker, right? This is the Republican Party, used to be a business party, right? The main reason that it's one of the main things separating MAGA coalition from the old Republican Party is the determination to become a workers' party of a kind. And one remembers Steve Bannon, the famous right wing ideologue, very interesting guy, um, telling Trump in 2016 that if he played his cards right, he could become the Roosevelt of the right. And in many ways, that's exactly what the MAGA group has been doing. I mean, for one thing, Trump becomes president in 2016 by winning 6 industrial states that had gone heavily for Obama 4 years earlier. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, and so on, North Carolina. Um, because many people say, and I think they're probably right, because of a feeling on the part of working people that the Democratic Party wasn't representing them in the same way that it had before. Didn't have their interest in that Republicans might have answers to some of the problems that were bothering them the most. In the in Trump's first administration, he didn't really get to do very much of anything, in part because of his own inexperience and lack of a well-developed program, and also because of COVID and other issues. In the second Trump administration, of which we're living through right now, we had an extremely well-developed program created mainly by the Heritage Foundation in its Project 2025, although there are also other right-wing ideologues who contributed to the program. And this is a program which is radical in the sense that it wants to make structural changes. It's making it, for example, identifies a main source of continued problems, unsolved problems, as government itself. And based on a theory that if government waste and fraud and so forth can be eliminated, the problems will be solved. It has they resulted in Muskism, and Musk coming in and shutting down government agencies and canceling foreign aid and so forth. Um, so, but also, this in some ways means that MAGA is they're not so much the new Roosevelts as the new anti-Roosevelts. They undertake to dismantle or deconstruct, as they have said, just deconstruct the administrative state. And the idea is by privatizing government services, actually, and by enriching the richest and in some ways most creative capitalists, members of the capitalist community, that there will then be a trickle down of the benefits from that enrichment, and everybody's going to get society will become more peaceful and more prosperous. This is not a view that I share. I have to say I think it's almost completely wrong, but it represents an understanding that the problems that we're suffering are systemic, not just personal, despite Donald Trump's tendency to personalize his enemies. The problems are systemic, and it offers a solution. Uh, it, is it actually going to turn out to be a solution? I think not. And I worried that what's going to happen when it turns out not to be a solution is going to be in bitterness on all sides, that increases the danger of violence. But I'll talk about that in a moment. There has already been some violence, as you know. We had an attack on the Capitol in January 2021, and I don't even want to get into the details about that, except simply to say that it happened. The extent to which the president incited it or didn't incite it is being debated. It happened. It was violent. People got killed. In my view, it should not have happened. But it was also not a revolution and not a civil war. There was also violence from the left, although we don't know actually what the politics are of the person that tried to assassinate the president. At least I don't know what his politics are. but it's certainly a violent act. With violence comes from the right, can come from the right, it can come from the left. And once again, it in some ways is a familiar type of violence if you're a historian of polarization in America. And the question is still whether it's going to lead in the direction of something worse, of mass violence. So let me say that in our field, there are some ideas I want to share with you, and I have to do it very quickly, um, about when we have to worry about violence becoming mass violence, and when we have to worry about conflicts that are not resolved um, getting worse. The first condition under which that happens is a condition in which core human needs are not satisfied. Right? Core human needs are not just physiological. It's not just the need for destruction, for survival, for three squares a day, but also psychological needs are key. And my great mentor in our field, John Burton, used to say that the most important needs that unsatisfied might cause violence, in his view, were needs for recognition and identity and and personal security, and also human development. Um, so that if these basic needs were not being met, it wasn't a question of some bad guys or good guys causing the violence. What was generating the violence was unsatisfied basic needs, core human needs. So that led people in our field and has led other people to ask, well, then why aren't those needs getting satisfied? What is there that doesn't satisfy them? One answer is the needs don't get satisfied when the social system is characterized by scarcities and inequality, radical inequality. When a few people have enormous power and control and also prestige, dignity, respect, and many people lack anything like that kind of power because of the seriously uneven distribution of wealth and resources. And we know in our society that our society has moved radically in this direction, in the direction of inequality. But why should this be producing violence? Well, another pioneer in our field, Johann Galtung, said, here's why. Because it's the system itself that becomes violent. In addition to direct violence, physical acts, people shooting at each other, people fist fighting with each other, or what we think of, kind of normally as violence. There are two other kinds of violence: structural violence and cultural violence. Structural violence takes place when you have a system based on inequality, and very often it's state violence that's used to maintain the inequality. So, for example, um, you go to Africa and kidnap black people and turn them into slaves, bring them back to the New World and turn them into slaves in the 18th, 19th centuries. That's direct violence. But in almost no time at all, you develop a system of structural violence, slave codes, legal codes, customs of communities, practices which, for example, the slaves are not allowed even to be married. They're not allowed to read and write in America. This kind of severe dehumanization, which is violent in the sense that it prevents people from developing their human potential. That's what makes violence violence, when it's compulsory things that prevent people from developing their human potential. The structural violence is supported by cultural violence, by beliefs and narratives that have built into them forms of discourse that have violence built into them. And the important thing here in Galtung's view is that these forms of violence generate each other. They don't exist separate from each other, they generate each other. If you have structural violence, it's going to become physical. It's going to end up with direct violence. If you have direct violence, in fact, it'll become structural or cultural after a time, as in the slave example that I just gave. And so, as long as you have the conditions producing structural violence, you're going to have. I mean, it's one reason that empire is such a violent system, right? That if we to have an imperialist power, like I'm afraid our own country is, uh, means to be in the violence business. Why? Because this kind of inequality generates, imperial violence, imperial domination generates rebellion. Not only that, it generates competition between other people who want to be empires. And so we get imperialist wars for several centuries. We've had imperialist wars. So if this is the problem, then how can we predict what's going to happen next? Well, there's one more piece that is good for you to know, might be useful to you to know. This is identified with an old friend of ours, a wonderful guy named Ted Gurr, who lived in Maryland and worked at the University of Maryland. He said that there is what he called relative deprivation. It's when you have certain expectations of welfare, of prosperity, of happiness, of opportunity that you think you're entitled to. And then the system doesn't deliver. And if you have an increase in expectations and or a decrease in system capabilities, so that there is a gap between what you think you're entitled to and what you're getting, the, the gap can become intolerable and it will generate rebellion of various kinds, says Gurr. So I remember this, in which I pointed out, I was starting to work on this book, that the gap between expectations and capabilities isn't just a matter of of temporarily of bad leadership or of people being unrealistic about their expectations. It's really being generated by systemic factors. Sometimes it's not the people who are bad, it's the system that's bad. In the sense, for example, let me give you an example of a bad system. Prisons, right? The prison is a bad system. I don't know what's going to replace it, but I can tell you that it's a bad system because it's a machine for violence, right? A prison is a place where people's basic human needs are systematically denied. To begin with, they're not given any freedom. They're not given normal sex and so forth. I mean, all kinds of needs are being denied. And the result is prisoners fight with prisoners, guards fight with prisoners, and guards abuse prisoners, and prisoners fight with guards. Everybody fights the prison administration. Riots are a regular, prison riots are a regular occurrence. And if you're trying to avoid saying that that's systemic, then you say things like, oh, the guards are so sadistic, or oh, the prisoners are incorrigible, or the prison administration is so inefficient. And all of those issues there may be some truth in all of those characterizations, but what you're avoiding is the truth that the system itself is generating the violence between prisoners between prisoners and guards, between the administration and everybody else. So if we know that there is such a thing as a system producing violence, what do we do about it? Well, conflict resolution people would tell us that if we want to resolve difficult conflicts, the way you do it is to focus on what the problems are that are causing the conflict and to multiply the options for resolution. That is to try to develop all of the possible solutions to these problems and talk about them so that people who disagree with each other about lots of things can agree on certain things. They can agree on what the problem is. They can agree, they may be able to agree even that some solutions to the problem are crazy and some are worth thinking about. They may even get to the point where they can sit down together and cost out what, talk about what the costs and benefits of different solutions are and come to some agreement. But none of this can happen if there are taboos that prevent you from considering what the problem is and the full range of solutions. Taboos are a main problem in seeking solutions to problems that cause polarization. Right? For example, I'll give you an example. The fact that people on the right and people on the left disagree about lots of things and have different, in many ways, different worldviews doesn't mean that they disagree about everything. They could agree, for example, that drug addiction is a major problem in the U.S. That we may be the most addicted country in the world. This is the major source of demand for drugs. And the demand is so enormous for illegal drugs, legal and illegal, that the supply is somebody's going to supply the demand. So what happens? We have this terrible plague of drug addiction and related issues of mental health, really. We also have a plague of suicides. And so how does the administration propose to solve that problem? Blowing up speedboats in the Caribbean. Right? You think blowing up speedboats in the Caribbean is going to solve our problem of drug addiction? Well, no, it's not. I mean, we have to face the fact that we're this great source of demand for drugs. But we can't do that if it's taboo to talk about it. So we overcome that taboo. And I'll tell you who's overcome the taboo. Um, uh, Religious people have overcome the taboo. Christians, including Christians who support the MAGA movement, overcome the taboo. They recognize their theory is that perhaps the major reason for drug addiction is the weakness of human will. Right there, many of them are Augustinian Christians who believe that that the fact that we're sinners in that sense is the most important thing about us. And therefore, you need something. You need to recognize Christ as your Savior, or you need to do something to strengthen the will and put yourself in a position to resist the temptation of drugs. Well, I've had discussions with Orthodox Christians about this sort of thing and found out that it's possible to disagree to some extent with this. I mean, I would not disagree. I don't disagree with the fact that people need help in resisting this kind of temptation. And if people think they can get it through one form of religion or another, that's a good thing. But the problem can't be reduced to it's not just a problem of the weakness of the human will. There are other factors generating the plague of drug addiction. There are economic insecurities and familial insecurities and psychological insecurities that are also playing a role. The fact that in fact, there's a relationship between drug addiction levels and poverty levels that we know about. That's been proved. There's a relationship in, uh, between drug addiction and community decay, underserved, underfinanced, right? Community services, especially mental health services that we know about. We can talk about, therefore, which kinds of solution to the drug problem make the most sense. And I think we can talk about them, these kinds of solutions, uh, despite the fact that we may disagree in terms of kind of which approach we prioritize. We may disagree. Um, but here's the second and related problem. If the taboo is not only a taboo, we're not supposed to talk about certain problems because I mean, for example, some people would say to recognize that we're the most addicted nation in the world means that we hate America if we say that. No, in fact, if you love it, you want to recognize what's wrong with it, right? So it's not a question of hate America, and it should not be taboo to talk about the demand side of this equation. But when we get to talking about, suppose we say, well, there's a relationship between drug addiction and um, uh, kind of congenital poverty in certain communities. What to do about the poverty? Well, one thing I would say, being a leftist in my own politics, I would say you're going to have to talk about some kind of economic planning to restore the health or to bring communities that are congenitally underfunded and poverty stricken back to health. That's a promise that's been made to people in those communities for as long as I can remember, and it's never been fulfilled. And one reason it hasn't been fulfilled, we haven't had a Marshall Plan for the cities or for impoverished rural areas. In part because of the taboo against talking about socialism or talking about any other form of economic planning. It doesn't necessarily even have to be social. I'm not even sure what socialism means anymore, to tell you the truth, but I do know that if you talk about interfering with the free market, about providing people with things that don't make a profit for somebody, because they are entitled to those things, then you're called a socialist. That's a form of taboo. And as long as we have that taboo against economic planning, in my view, we're not going to, all sorts of problems we're not going to be able to solve, including the problem of immigration, of how to deal with the fact that we have a systemic labor shortage in the United States. We need immigrants. Even Donald Trump has recognized that recently. We need immigrants, but we don't necessarily want all immigrants pouring into communities where there's already economic problems and low-wage workers are going to suffer if there are too many immigrants that come into a community with low-wage workers. There are answers to that, but they require economic planning. So if you taboo solutions to problems, you never solve the problems. And if you don't solve the problems, then you start worrying about long-term mass violence becoming mass violence. So there's a high stake game here. We eliminate the taboo, and we move towards problem solving dialogues in which you define the problem. You find right wing and left wing people can agree on what a lot of these problems are. For example, right wing and left wing people can agree that there's been too many American wars. America's involved in too many foreign wars. There's strong agreement between elements of the right and left on that. They might even agree that the military-industrial complex has gotten too big and is taking up too much of the federal budget, and that those funds need to be somehow transferred to satisfying human needs, of social needs. And the question then is how to do that. Well, you identify the sources of the problem, and then you consider, without taboos, proposals to eliminate or mitigate them. And then maybe you get to cost the proposals out and agree on some plan that you can implement. It has happened before. It happened actually in the New Deal that agreements like this were reached. And there are some signs that people on the right and on the left are interested in having it happen now. On the right, I I attended the Charlie Kirk funeral by online and I have to say was both in some ways disturbed and in other ways impressed by the power of the religious spirit on the right. It made me think both that Christian nationalism is a problem, but also that religious orientation is not necessarily a problem, maybe part of a solution, because it also creates a language in which people who are interested in religion from the left, right, and center can talk to each other. Uh, I also noticed in New York, as I'm sure you did, that there is now more of a willingness on the part of voters to engage in non-taboo speculation about possible government programs. In the case of Zoran Andami, who calls himself a democratic socialist, actually what he's proposing for New York isn't socialism so much as a kind of New Dealism, I would say. But again, it opens the door to kind of more thinking about, in a more experimental way, about solutions that might work. Solutions that it means overcoming taboos, if you like. It makes me wonder whether we might not even be moving towards a situation in which we could overcome the taboo against talking about a a world community in addition to a national community. Right? One of the most constraining ideas I know in our current discussions about problem solving is the idea that you have to bow and scrape before the God of the nation. That if you say anything negative about America, it means that you hate America. And even if you're a Democrat, or if you consider yourself a liberal, and you stop short of talking about the possibility of developing a global consciousness that would transcend, not eliminate national consciousness, because national consciousness is part of our character, but would transcend national consciousness in the same way that the nation transcended, village consciousness. When I was a kid, I remember the exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called The Family of Man. The idea was that that was our true family. Our true family was human, not just America. And the idea of if America first means we take care of ourselves and everybody else can then take care of themselves, we're not responsible for them. It's certainly not Christian, not Jewish, not Muslim. It's not anything, but state idolatry. But how do we get to where we can even talk about that is the question. It seems to me we can get there. And I have to say that at the end of all of this, it seems to me this is the last thing I want to say. The irony of this is that we think about polarization. You start by thinking about polarization as a dangerous situation, a situation that could produce civil war. And if problems don't get solved after a while, it is dangerous. But polarization is also the road to conflict resolution, right? Because it's through polarization that we get the kind of open discussion of possible structural reforms that we would not otherwise be able to get to, that we would just be kind of doing business as usual, while the problems multiply, while the problems accumulate. But no, we don't have to do that. Where are the ideas going to come from for how things can be changed? They're going to come from the a kind of vigorous, noisy debate about what the problems really are and what the best solutions are, how to solve them. That's not the sort of thing that experts are going to do necessarily sitting in the quiet of their offices. This is the kind of thing that's going to happen when you have a discussion that gets hot. So that when I see people saying, well, the answer to polarization is everybody should lower their voice, right? Everybody should be, watch out, watch your rhetoric, lower your voice. Don't, be nicer to the other side. No, no, no. You say, yes, stop threatening the other side. Yes, stop calling them names, but don't lower your voice. Raise it in defense of what you think are the most creative solutions, even if they're tabooed, currently tabooed solutions. That, it seems to me, is the road to conflict resolution. So thank you very much for your attention. I've gone a bit longer than I intended to. I can be contacted anytime if you want to continue this discussion after this, after today. There's my there's my email and fax number and website. So and I appreciate your attention, and I'm interested to see what you have to say now. So I will stop sharing. Here we are.
Well,
Louise.
you might have about 130 emails in an hour because with that invitation, I think,
That'd be okay.
and your thought-provoking talk, I think you might get a lot of emails there. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking in a way that I know I hadn't thought about it. Um, so allow me to kick off the questions here. So when you said talk louder and have more raised voices and more passion and to try to solve it, where does that normally come from? From whom? Is it from leadership? Is it from the masses? Is it from some charismatic figure that comes out of left field? Historically, and then in your judgment, where does it come from?
Well, it can come from leaders in the sense that you can have a political campaign. You can have an election campaign where there are vigorous debates, respectful and vigorous debates. Um, but our two-party system hasn't really worked very well to produce that kind of exchange. And I think the main place it comes from now it comes from localities. It comes from people locally deciding to talk to each other, reach out across these lines, and talk to each other. And that is happening here and there. Um, so I mean, I think of in Washington, D.C., I think of an institution like, for example, like Busboys and Poets, Andy Shalal's restaurants, where this much more of this kind of discussion could take place at a place like Busboys. Busboys is now more, associated with the progressive cause. So people on the right might not go there voluntarily or might not go there very quickly, but there's no reason why they couldn't be invited,
Mhm.
and vice versa. I mean, I've written some books about religion and conflict, and I've been invited to speak in some very conservative churches, um, which has been fascinating. That absolutely fascinating. So I know we can find ways to do this if we decide we're going to do it. But but it has to be done right, you know. I mean, it has to be um, um, we had a student who was at one point at the Carter School, who was a nun, a graduate student, a PhD student, and she organized and in fact, did her dissertation on um, uh, discussion groups, workshops on abortion. Um, and part of that discussion was to get people who were pro-choice or pro-life to listen to each other's stories, not to argue about, when does conception begin and, whether life begins at conception. That would have been a waste of time to argue. But to get to talk to each other about why they believed what they believed, how they had come to believe and act the way they did, and then to agree on things that they might do together despite the continuing disagreements over the the morality and legality of abortion. And in Buffalo, New York, where they had one of these meetings, they agreed to work together to improve the adoption system in Buffalo. Because they could all agree there was a problem, an adoption problem. Parents who wanted children weren't getting them, and children who needed parents weren't getting them. So, so I often think of that as showing, the possibilities of cooperative action despite
Okay,
serious disagreements, ideological disagreement.
great. So now we have some other people that have chimed in. Let me just read some of the questions to you. It seems to me, this is from Stephen, it seems to me extremely difficult, if not unrealistic, to expect such a polarized society as we've become can resolve differences when there's such a fundamental split in what people believe to be the facts. Comment, please, how we can get to common understanding of facts if leaders only reinforce alternative facts.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I actually don't know what the answer is. I, I think what you're calling a disagreement about the facts that's a piece of a little piece, a small piece of the problem is that people actually have disagreement about what the facts are. For example, um, some people think that 9/11 was an inside job, but the government actually somehow created 9/11. And that's a genuine disagreement about what the facts are. But often what we call a disagreement about the facts is more like a disagreement between lawyers. I mean, I was a lawyer for a few years, and I know that when you write a brief, there are certain facts that you emphasize and certain facts that you don't talk about at all, or that you explain away, um, in your case. So if you have different, in other words, you prioritize the facts differently. You don't really disagree about the facts, but you prioritize them differently. So I think that's pretty much what I was talking when I talked about the drug disagreements that people might have over how to treat drug addiction. Some people would tend to emphasize more the facts of human, sinfulness, and other people might tend to identify more, emphasize the facts about no bad economic conditions. But that doesn't mean either side would the other deny the facts of the other side, right? They would deny the relevance
Okay.
of the facts, and that you can have a discussion about that. I mean, that's not the same. That's not the, that's not as radical a disagreement as when people actually disagree about what the facts are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Uh, Faria um, comments here. Thank you very much, Rich, for an excellent presentation as always. So she must know you well. Since you focused on structural violence and conflict, will you shed more light on various other forms of systemic inequalities, such as gender and racial inequalities, besides class economic inequalities? Connecting it more with the topic of I'm sorry, connecting it more with the topic of your presentation today. In other words, if you can share a bit about the so-called taboo topics, such as white supremacy, white nationalism, linking them with how they are creating polarization. Though you mentioned in your presentation that Christian nationalism could be utilized as an opportunity to unite people, I wonder about the people who are not Christian. Thanks again.
Yes, well, yes, I have to say that I emphasize the class issues when I talk about structure because they're so de-emphasized up until recently. They've been so de-emphasized. And you may agree or may not agree. I don't know that in an era where there was a great deal of talk about gender, structural inequality, and so forth on the basis of gender and race and sexual preference, also, there was very little attention paid to class. And I guess what I would say is we have to absolutely pay attention to all of those sources of structural equality. Clearly, race is it still an issue in the United States and is going to be an issue for some time. Clearly, it seems to me critical race theory ought to be taught in the schools because it ought to be taught and can be taught right. Right? Critical race theory. It's it's been so maligned and kind of such a deformed definition has been given of critical race theory that people now think, oh, critical race theory means you're going to blame every white person alive today for slavery, and that sort of thing. That's not what critical race theory is. It was a structural theory, and which didn't have didn't doesn't isn't based on a good guy bad guy analysis. But in fact, critical race theory, if it's taught right, is the kind of structural theory which can relieve people of guilt that they don't have to be carrying around. And the same thing clearly is true as you say Christian nationalism. I didn't say. I'm sorry if I gave the impression that I said that Christian nationalism was a good thing or a road to conflict resolution. Christian nationalism, which I think is a contradiction in terms. I don't see how you can be a good Christian and a nationalist and an ultra nationalist. I, what I meant to say was intensely felt religious feelings which take the form of, say, intense evangelical commitments. That can be a road to discussion, to a deep, a meaningful discussion of what these conflicts are really all about. Christian nationalism, no. Because, and and certainly gender issues and sexual preference issues are as alive as they ever were, as difficult to deal with as they ever were. And the attack on transgender people that's now taking place under the Trump administration, I think, is a dangerously ultra right wing attack. Um, so yes, we have to talk about those forms of, but we have to talk about. Let me say one other thing about that. So a buzzword when we talk about these different forms of structural inequality, a buzzword is intersectionality. And the trouble with intersectionality is what we need to know is what's the relationship between class and race and gender and sexual preference. How does how do those things actually interlock? How do they, in fact, create each other? And intersectionality, as it's kind of used as a buzzword, is kind of you kind of bow in the direction of that analysis, but you don't do the analysis. And if you don't do the analysis, you don't you then you don't get to solutions of these problems. I can give some examples of that, but I think I probably said enough about that now.
Well, it's interesting. You have what, four variables in there? So trying to reconcile four variables of sexual preferences and race and gender inequality and whatever the else you said. It's like a
Well,
complex puzzle, right? A 3D, 4D puzzle.
yeah, but you have to do it because if you don't do it, for example, then you'll say, well, race, if what you're really thinking is race is the main thing, right? Uh, then you're going to say, well, let's have affirmative action, even though that means that poor whites don't get jobs, right? Or if you do the same thing with gender, I mean, you could do the same thing with class and say, we'll deal with the class issues and it doesn't matter, but the gender implications don't matter. Well, you, you, you really need to keep all of those things in focus so that you're not um, basically creating a problem over here, but you solve this problem, you create that one. You
Mhm.
know, see what I mean?
Yep, yep, yep. So let me move on here. Eve says, ask the question, where does respect fit into conflict management? Conflict management takes time and both parties meeting each other's basic needs. Often the party arguing does not understand what their basic needs are.
Well, that's two questions, but they're both very good. I mean, the first question is, what about respect? And I have to tell you that the conflict people interest people interested in conflict resolution or conflict transformation now are paying a lot more attention than they used to the whole question of dignity. And people are starting to understand, as they didn't used to understand, that you can oppress somebody, deny them things that they ought to have, underpay them, and work them too hard, and or treat them badly, and still not hurt them as badly or get the same kind of reaction as if you humiliate them. And humiliation, depriving people of dignity, seems to be in some ways a more inflammatory thing to do, a more conflict producing and violence producing thing to do than even kind of normal oppression. So now people are studying that, and humiliation studies really has become a feature of places like the Carter School and also other institutions, Notre Dame and San Diego and other places are studying in humiliation. My colleague Dan Rothbard at Carter School studies humiliation. Um, and that's so anyway, I think that's a new insight. Um, when people, and also, so the second question was about human needs and people not knowing what their needs are.
Right.
Well, um, I'm not sure. I'm not sure when you say people don't know what their needs are. Maybe not. I mean, maybe in some ways, I guess that's a definition of neurosis. You don't know what your needs are. Um, but one of the ways in which and one of the ways that people are dealing with making it clear to people what their needs are, people are making it clear to themselves what their needs are and what other people's needs are, is there's a lot of attention now being paid in our field to narratives and narrative theory. That it's one thing to kind of stand aside and try to analyze somebody's, kind of internal processes and all of that. Um, and you get all kinds of things wrong when you do that. Um, but if you're listening to the stories that they're telling and then analyzing the stories and help getting them to analyze their own stories and other people's stories. This whole question of what the needs are, how they're expressed, and how to satisfy them gets gets presented in a much more, I don't know, much more useful way, and a much more creative way, um, because uh, people reveal themselves in their stories, and if people, a lot of times people don't realize that they're telling themselves a story, that they're living, a role in a story, and they realize it right away as soon as you start talking about it. But this is what I hear you say. This is the story that I hear you telling. People will say, "Oh yeah, sure," unless it's also a way to sometimes to deal with taboos. But so anyway, in at the Carter School, we have Solon Simmons and other people doing a narrative lab, which is absolutely fascinating because you get people to tell their stories. You can also look, as Solon has looked at types of narrative, and it's a way of not simply dealing with people in terms of how left or how left wing or how right wing you are, but what kind of story are you? What kind of story is most important to you? What are the stories that are influence your whole the way you live and the way you think?
Mhm.
And there's some like basic stories that are very, very powerful in every society. Um,
And multidimensional, to your point earlier,
that's
multidimensional,
that's
right?
right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
yes.
Yeah.
Well, let me move along here. Um, Margaret asks, considering the number of guns in America, how close are we heading to civil war?
Well, I think based on what I said before, um, I don't think. I mean, I think it's a bad thing to have these to be drowning in guns, which we are. Um, but I don't think there's a necessary connection between that and civil war. I mean, there certainly is a connection between that and school shootings and suicides and accidents and I mean all kinds of things that shouldn't be happening. Um, and I do believe we need to have some form of gun control. Um, but for the reasons really that I said before, I think we, I think the danger of civil war increases the longer problems go unsolved, serious problems go unsolved. And we are going to see fairly soon, certainly by the end of the first Trump administration, we're going to see which problems have been solved and which haven't by the approach that the Trump administration, that the MAGA, movement has been using to solve problems. I think we're going to find a bunch of unsolved problems. And then the question is, then what? And, at that point, some people may say, well, we'll, you know, we can't trust any of these politicians. Or some people may say the problem with Trump is that he wasn't far enough to the right. Right? We need a real fascist,
Mhm.
which I really think Trump is not yet. Um,
You
but I
don't think
fear,
you don't think he's getting there?
I think there are tendencies in his approach,
Okay,
in his politics that are fascistic.
okay.
But but no, and I don't, you might say it's almost like calling Franklin Roosevelt a communist. Were there kind of socialist tendencies in the New Deal? You bet.
Hmm.
But it didn't go, when one could say, sometimes I wish he'd gone further in that direction, but he didn't.
Okay, okay.
So, and I think that's true. And I'm really, what every time we have a discussion like this, I always think the question I ask myself is this helping us find solutions to these problems? or is this a kind of diversion from these solutions? I mean, I have to say, I shouldn't even say this, but in some ways, I even feel that way about Epstein, the Epstein file. I mean, I don't have to say I think what an atrocity I think the Epstein and his friends committed, and how terrible it was for the women involved and so on. And yes, I think the papers ought to be, that well, now we're going to find out what I guess what's in those files. But at the same time that I think we need to do that, I don't disagree that we need to find out what's in those files. I also keep saying, is this going to, you know, is this going to increase wages? Is this going to stop deindustrialization?
Mhm.
Is this going to help transgender people? Is this going to, is this going to end, is this going to eliminate any of the 750 military bases that we have abroad that we don't need, most
Mhm.
of which we don't need to have?
Okay.
That the the problems of inequality-based problems, that are causing us so much trouble. In some ways, you sort of continue to avoid dealing with them by, uh, in a sense, entertaining yourself with
Mhm.
scandals.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Let me continue because there are three more questions and I would like to try to get to all of them. Chris says your term sexual preference implies that you don't prefer sex. The current term is sexual orientation. So she kind of phrased it a little bit funny about
right.
preferring.
I agree with you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Bill asked the question, would you agree that even religious and secular orientations are not irreconcilable, that people can bond despite such basic differences?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. And I have to say, I think one of the keys to that is an understanding of what Robert Bellah, the sociologist, meant by civil religion. Bellah has this, I think it's a wonderful um, concept that instead of always thinking of secularity and religiousness as being opposite, in poles, I mean, for historical reasons, that was a conflict that lasted a long time, still there. But in fact, secular people think and act in some ways which are also could be called religious. Um, and in, I mean, I've been for a long time interested in Marxism, and I think Marxism in some ways is a secular religion. It's value oriented as well as quote scientific
Mm.
unquote. Um, and so this I don't think that secular religious barrier needs to be a barrier at all or much of a barrier. Um, because when people talk about uh, people even in a polarized era talk about politics in a way that's familiar to religious thinkers, even if they're not doing it on the basis of any organized religion,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
you know. Yeah.
Jan asks, can you talk about the influence of social media in the current situation and what can be done to reach low information voters?
Yeah, as you probably know, that's a good question, and there's been a lot of interest. There is a lot of interest in it at the moment among my students, among the graduate students, especially. We're now getting a lot of dissertations and articles and other research being done on the impact of social media. Um, and I have to say, I think there are all kinds of, I don't know the answer to the question. You can, you can see on the one hand that social media creates a kind of cacophony. It's a a blooming, buzzing confusion, right? People can say anything they like, and they do, and it seems to be doing us no good. Sometimes it seems to be doing us no good whatsoever, and only making things difficult for people, being a cause of violence and a cause of irrationality. Um, on the other hand, it's also, I keep asking myself, what's the potential? Or if you could redesign that system, how would you redesign it so that it would become a positive good? Because, you can't, it also has created a platform in which people can express themselves. People who never used to
Mhm.
be able to express themselves can express themselves. It's also created opportunities for us to have this kind of conversation online. And for me, my goodness, it's for a teacher. I mean, I've been a teacher for like 50 years, and I've got I don't know how many students out there, some thousand, more than 1,000, and I'm getting to talk to them, and see them
Mhm.
sometimes, see them face to face, and talk to them. It's wonderful, which is wonderful. Um,
Mhm.
So, I mean, there's so much potential for good, in this kind of increasing communication. I can't believe that we can't figure out how to do this better. But the question implies that there's a lot of destruction coming from it, and I agree with that. There is a lot of destruction coming from it.
It's
I mean,
also quite it's a lot of it's very superficial, and people have a thought and they share it without thinking about the implications. They just get it out there. And I wonder even how much strongly they believe it. It's just I have an urge to get something out there and I get it out there.
yeah,
So
well, the main, I guess, one of the main problems is the kind of the polarization. To go back to polarization again. Um, that if you go online and you read somebody's views on something, and then mostly what you see is comments saying how great those views are. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I mean, if I put stuff online, I do quite often. I
mhm,
put stuff online, and most of what I get back is, "Gee, I'm glad that was great. I'm glad
mhm,
you said that." And I say, no, you kind of wish that somebody would kind of intelligently take issue with you.
mhm, mhm.
But if somebody wants to take issue with you, very often it's not intelligent. It's just some kind of name calling.
Right, 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 right.
Um,
Let
but
me
I
get
have
to
to,
this.
yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Yeah,
Let
go
me,
ahead.
I want to get to this one last question.
Sure.
Can you highlight some engagements you are aware of that give you hope?
Um, sure. One engagement that gives me hope is the work of a good friend of mine, a rabbi named Bruce Aft, who is in Arlington. So, well, he's in Springfield. But he's very well known in Arlington. He's done some work for our school, a good deal of work for our school and for the university, George Mason University. And Aft's work trying to get Jews and blacks and other people to talk to each other uh, in a humane kind of way, understanding kind of way, to learn more about each other. And this is that's been very hopeful. Um, There's a bunch of conversations that he and people that he's working with, including my colleague at the Carter School, Charles Chavis, the historian. Um, they're working on conversations that are really quite interesting. Um, my colleague Mark Gopin at the Carter School has been involved in conversations with right-wing Christians and with police about the role of police in the community, the role of crime and punishment and guilt and all of that, which really are very, very promising, very promising. I mean, part of the I think part of what's needed, part of the answer to this is that picking things to talk about with people you can talk to them about that aren't simply a red flag, a kind of red flag issue. Um, like, should we pray in the schools? No, I think we should not pray in the schools. But I'm not going to talk to somebody if somebody thinks that we should pray in the schools. I'm not sure that that's a discussion that's going to go anywhere,
Mhm.
right? But if I mentioned in my talk, let's talk about drug addiction, all right? And not prayer in the schools,
Mhm.
or um, lots of other issues. I think if you uh, take the police and crime and kind of what to do about that. That's another issue where you're not going to find too many people now who are going to say either defund the police or let them do what they like. There are a few people on both sides that might say that, but most people, even though they may be thoroughly polarized on other issues, are going to say, well, security is an issue for everybody, including poor people, and we can't just disband the police force. But then the question is, but what are you doing to eliminate the causes of crime?
Mhm.
And um, the answer is, you know, the answer is nothing. If we've had three presidential crime commissions that say there's a link between poverty and crime. Doesn't mean all poor people are criminals, doesn't mean criminals are all poor, but there's a link between poverty and crime. If you have a high poverty rate in a community, almost certainly there's going to be a high degree of poverty. And not even talking here about white collar crime, which is a problem also, but it needs to be dealt with. But
Mhm.
I'm talking about street crime.
Mhm. Mhm.
So what are you doing? What are you doing about that? Well, if you can move towards community policing and violence interruption and programs like that so that you're not doing mass incarceration and which is basically educating criminals to be better criminals, then that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. It's a good thing, but it also doesn't deal with the, the problem at its root.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we can deal with the problem at its root. Other societies have done it, but we have to make some decisions and we have to think about the problem in a different way to do that. Could we have a discussion across right wing, left wing lines about eliminating poverty? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Some people are going to say, well, if you're poor, you deserve to be, because you didn't work hard enough or whatever.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But actually, I have a lot of conservative people I know who understand that's nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, this has been a very enlightening afternoon for us. So thank you very much to get us to think differently and think more broadly about these issues. I want to remind everybody that we've recorded this session with Dr. Rubenstein. So it will be on our YouTube channel in a couple days. So if you'd like to hear it again and kind of digest this a little bit more, it was a lot of concepts you threw at us. So thank you very much. I also want to remind you all to take the survey after when this completes, when we finish this, and let us know what you think, and we will pass along your comments to Dr. Rubenstein. I also want to remind you to join us on December 8th, which is a Monday, and we will be talking to Emma Villard Sanchez, who is an immigrant, and she will be talking to us about her story as an immigrant and also what she's done in Arlington in terms of the educational system and giving other immigrants uh, chances and helping them overcome their challenges. So that should be a very worthwhile presentation. I really can't thank you enough. I think you just did a great job and
well, thank you I appreciate the chance to be here, and thank you very much for you and the whole gang there. It was fun.
Well,
We'll do this again
well,
sometime.
well, thank you. I guess it was a win-win because we certainly won on our side. So thank
Okay.
you very much. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you next time. Bye.